Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. Let's just jump right into this. Manuel asks, I'm kind of scared that I'm losing some of the motivation or drive that I had at first. I used to immerse 6 to 12 hours a day actively, but now it's getting hard to find content that is engaging. Right now, I'm freaking out since I love the language and I'm scared that I'll drop it. Any tips that I could use or learn from? Yeah, so interesting question, kind of because it sounds like, based on what you're saying, right, that you're very passionate about the language, right? You're saying, I love the language. I love the language so much that I'm actually like preemptively scared that I'm going to lose motivation. So the fact that you're asking this question in the first place, I think shows that you're pretty motivated. So my first initial thought is that you probably don't have too much to be worried about in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I mean, in general, it's really normal to have kind of like peaks and valleys in your motivation throughout time. It's just always going to happen. We have different things going on in our lives, we go through different phases. And so, yeah, it's always good to have some kind of tricks in your bag of tools, that you can use to help keep yourself kind of pumped and interested in the language. The first thing that you can probably do that makes the biggest difference is just get really, really serious about finding new immersion content in your language. Like, I think I tweeted about this once in the past, but once you get past a certain level in a language, having a habit of regularly seeking out new engaging content is, in a way, one of your main duties as a language learner. Like, I think sometimes we as language learners, it's easy for us to start thinking about it like, oh, well, there's just, tons of interesting content, or at least there should be just tons of interesting content lying around everywhere I look. And so if one day I wake up and I don't have any content to watch, well, that's like the language's fault, right? But in reality, even if there is a lot of interesting content, we have to go and find that content ourselves. And there's certain types of content which, we might have just stumbled into because we happen to have known it because it's really famous, or because someone told it to us, or because Netflix recommended it to us. But there's also lots of content out there that you just probably don't know about, right? And so it's up to you to go and get creative about finding ways to discover that new content, right? Asking more people for recommendations, trying out a new genre that you've never looked into before, but is really popular in your target language and things like this. And so for me, a lot of times when my motivation was kind of waning when I was in my hardcore Japanese phase, is I would kind of change up the medium of stuff I would consume. So if I was watching anime for a while and I was starting to get kind of bored of anime, then I'd switch and like watch some Japanese drama for a while, or I'd go out and get into manga for a while. Or if I got bored of manga, then I'd read novels. Or if I got bored of novels, maybe I'd read like a nonfiction book. And I would try to switch things around like this to keep it fresh. And then when I did get kind of, let's say, back into drama, then I'd go and look for a famous drama, right? Sometimes I'd watch a new popular drama because it's fun to kind of be watching something new along with natives. You can kind of like watch other YouTube videos about native speakers reacting to that content as it comes out every week. That can be fun. And of course, it's fun to go back and watch like really famous works that came out years ago but remain pretty popular within the cultural zeitgeist and had a big influence on the popular culture. And so really the landscape, I don't know exactly what your target language is, but if any one of these like really popular languages like Japanese, Chinese, French, German, like there's an infinite amount of content out there. Like a lot of times I think about how even if like time was frozen right now and I could only watch Japanese content that existed today and no new Japanese content was ever going to be created, I still have like multiple lifetimes worth of content that already exists that I could use to keep myself preoccupied and continue to improve my Japanese. So it's really up to you to work hard and get creative about going and finding new content and discovering new avenues to entertain yourself. That's probably the biggest thing. Besides this, other things that you can do is, like for me, when I would have a really positive interaction with a native speaker in Japanese, that always makes me really motivated. It still does to this day, right? When something, you meet a native speaker on the street and you have like a really good conversation, or you're able to help a native speaker out with something and you were only able to do that because you knew their language. Anytime you have some kind of positive experience with another human being that relied on your target language, for me, that would make me super motivated. So, if you don't know any native speakers, you can try making some friends. That can motivate you. And another thing is, let's see. There was one more thing I was about to say. Oh yeah, the other one is kind of remind yourself why you wanted to learn the language in the first place, and kind of like put yourself back there mentally. So for me, there was like a couple anime that I watched when I was like brand new to Japanese and first getting into anime. And it's not that these anime were really good or anything, but because it was the first anime that I'd ever watched, it was like, it had a really big impact on me, and they felt way better than they really were. I also watched them at a very impressionable time. So for a while, whenever I needed more motivation, I would go back and watch my favorite scenes from my favorite anime, and that would like get me pumped up. So it doesn't necessarily have to be media. Like if you had an experience that made you want to learn the language, like you took a trip there or something, then you can go back and look at pictures of the trip that you took and trying to like put yourself back there, remember the dream, remember why you wanted that language in the first place. And maybe, do that regularly, right? So all these things that I've said here, I would think of it as, maintaining your motivation is like part of your duty as a language learner. Like just like your duty is to do your Anki reps every day and do immersion every day, an additional part of your duty is to be always finding new content, managing your motivation, reminding yourself why you want to learn the language, keeping the process fun, always changing things up. That's equally part of your duty to make it happen. And the other thing that I would say, and that Ethan always says, right, is that in the first place, you don't want to necessarily be relying entirely on motivation. Motivation does come and go. And so it's also important to build routines and habits that will keep you going and keep you immersing and keep you doing the things you need to be doing to keep making progress, even on days that you don't feel that motivated. So that's the other important kind of piece of the puzzle here. But because you specifically asked about motivation, I kind of focused on ways that you can up your motivation. But of course, building habits and routines so that you're not totally reliant on motivation is important in the first place, or isn't important as well. So Alfie asks, how viable is a minimalist Anki approach? 10 to 15 cards per day or so. I'm dyslexic and read extremely slowly in both languages, and I fail a decent amount of cards because of it. My reps take a long time and much of my energy and motivation. And can be quite demoralizing at the time, taking away from my immersion and enjoyment. Anki is crucial, but if I do a lot of immersion and only add really juicy sentences, will this be viable? So someone already commented on this question, but 10 to 15 cards per day is not a minimalist approach. That's a very standard amount of Anki cards. I always made 10 cards a day when I was in my hardcore Japanese phase. So when I was doing nothing but learning Japanese all day, every day, I was learning 10 new cards a day. So that is like what I consider to be a standard average good amount. 15 would be on the heavy side, like you're doing a lot of cards per day. Some people do 20 or 25, but I personally would never recommend that because that's just too much in my opinion. And so what I would consider to be a minimalist approach would be between like 1 and 5 cards per day, right? Or actually between 0 and 5 cards a day. That would be a minimalist approach. If you actually are able to do 10 to 15 cards a day, well then great. You're not even an Anki minimalist. You're an Anki average to slightly intensive user, and so you have no problems. If you feel like 10 to 15 cards per day is too much, like I said, I would personally recommend 10, but if you find that 10 is feeling like too much, then yeah, you can definitely do less. You can do 0 to 5. Anki is not really, you wrote that Anki is crucial, but I mean, remember, lots of people have reached fluency in a foreign language without using Anki. In fact, most people who have become fluent in a foreign language did it without Anki, right? And so it's totally possible. The most important thing is immersion, not Anki. Anki, of course, does have a lot of benefits and can make the process a lot more efficient, especially at certain points in the language learning process. But, I mean, yeah, you got to do what you got to do, right? If Anki is really challenging for you and it's like really draining and affecting your ability to spend a lot of time doing immersion and other activities, then probably you're going to be better off doing less of it and doing more immersion instead, or having more high quality immersion, because immersion is ultimately by far the most important component of the process. And so, yeah, I would experiment with different amounts of Anki, see what works well for you. But overall, if you're able to do 10 per day, then really you don't have anything to worry about, because that's not a minimalist approach. That's a pretty intensive approach in the first place. Or not intensive, but an average solid amount. So Marcus asks, "Hi Matt, are you planning any interviews with people who've reached a high level of fluency? I think listening to success stories is always a good type of motivation." I imagine that I'll definitely interview more people who are more successful language learners in the future. As you may have noticed, I am taking a break from YouTube right now and doing a couple other things. And so whenever I decide to go back to making YouTube videos on my channel, I will probably do more success stories and more interviews with success stories of Japanese or maybe other languages. But I don't know exactly when that is, because I also don't know exactly when I'll go back to regularly making YouTube videos. So Cameron asks, is using more free flow immersion an effective method to get to fluency? I have gotten to the point where I can watch content in free flow and enjoy the shows. However, I have to convince myself to do intensive immersion, and it often kills my motivation for anything else after. Can I just keep doing free flow immersion with the hopes that speaking will still come, or does the intensive immersion piece need to be more involved? I would say if you're at the point where you can do free flow immersion and comprehend most of it, have a pretty good comprehension level, then you don't need to do intensive immersion. You can just do free flow immersion. Remember, we all learned our native language entirely through free flow immersion, and so in my opinion, free flow immersion is actually more important than intensive immersion in the big picture. Just the important thing is that it has to be comprehensible, right? A lot of times when you first start learning a language, the content won't be comprehensible, and doing intensive immersion when you're looking lots of things up, that act itself greatly raises the comprehensibility. But as long as you're at the point where you have enough comprehension where you can be comfortably enjoying shows in free flow mode, well then, yeah, you're as long as you're comprehending things, then your comprehension is going to keep going, and in a way, I kind of talked about this in the last Q&A, but free flow immersion is actually better for building automaticity and natural language ability. And so I think doing free flow immersion is a lot more likely to actually contribute to cultivating speaking ability than doing intensive immersion is, right? Intensive immersion, you're kind of in this more like conscious mode where you're thinking about the language, you're analyzing the language as you're going. Whereas to be good at speaking, you need an intuitive, natural sense for the language, where you don't even need to think about it. It just comes to you. You just have it, and you build that through free flow immersion. And so, yeah, with the caveat that you still have a high level of comprehension, then I think you're totally fine not doing intensive immersion. Later on, you'll probably want to start reading at some point to really grow your vocabulary, because the thing is, the one thing about about free flow immersion is that a lot of times some words that don't show up extremely frequently will kind of just go over your head, and you won't pick them up. And this even happens in our native language, right? Like the average 15-year-old, right? There's a lot of words that 15-year-old doesn't know, but they've probably heard at least a couple times, right? So it takes native speakers sometimes, 20 plus years of spending their entire lives immersed in the language to develop the level of vocabulary that, a college-educated native speaker has. And so I found that for me, making lots of Anki cards and looking lots of things up as I was consuming content allowed me to grow my vocabulary really quickly and catch up to the point of a native speaker in a matter of 5 years. And so I think if I was only doing free flow immersion, then that definitely wouldn't have happened, right? I had to be looking things up and making lots of Anki cards. That helped me kind of bridge that gap between going from basic fluency to a native like level of passive vocabulary. And so if that's important to you, then you want to do that, but you can also do that through reading. So, you can get fluent in the spoken language through doing free flow listening immersion, and then you can also read and then make cards when you're reading. And I think if you do those two activities, then you'll be totally fine. And if right now you're more focused on the spoken language and more on listening and on doing free flow immersion, then I think that's totally fine, and that would be good for your pronunciation as well. So then later on, when you get more comfortable in the spoken language and you're starting to feel that you're kind of plateauing when it comes to developing your passive vocabulary, but you already do have a pretty good grasp of the spoken language, that would be a good time to start reading and making cards while you read, looking more things up when you read, because reading is inherently more aligned with doing intensive immersion, right? Because you're already making your own pace as you're going. The words are all there on the page. A lot of times listening based content like shows, podcasts, movies, they lend themselves to free flow immersion more anyway. So that's kind of how I think about it. So yeah, you'll definitely still get fluent in the spoken language doing nothing but free flow like listening immersion. You might eventually plateau when it comes to your vocabulary. Not plateau, but you'll start making slower gains. If you want to really catch up to a native level of vocabulary, then you'll probably need to like intervene, make a lot of Anki cards and stuff. But you can do that anytime. So, Cam asks, "Hi Matt, watching the May 28th Q&A made me realize that," I'll just write this here in case someone watches this video years in advance. "The May 28th, 2022 Q&A made me realize that I'm flexing my brain almost 100% of the time when I'm listening to Japanese, analyzing grammar, recalling or actively recalling word meanings, and thinking about how things are phrased, etc. I'm trying 2 months of nothing but free flow listening, but I'm having a lot of trouble breaking the habit of flexing my brain. I don't know what to do with my attention. Any tips?" Yeah, so I definitely can relate to what you're talking about. I mean, mental habits are a thing, right? So if you have mental habits of always analyzing the language, then you're not just going to be able to like snap your fingers and turn that off, right? There's certain momentum associated with those habits, and you have to let them kind of like unwind themselves over time, right? I think I talked about this in last Q&A, but it does become a lot like meditation, right? Where when you're meditating, you're practicing keeping your, well, there's lots of different types of meditation, but if you're doing concentration meditation, for example, then you have a meditation object that you're trying to keep your attention on, and what you do is you direct your attention towards that meditation object, and then before you know it, your mind naturally wanders. You don't know that it wanders. You go into mind wandering, and then you suddenly have this kind of like aha moment where you realize that you were mind wandering. And so what you do when you have that moment is that you just redirect your attention back to the meditation object. And you just do that over and over again. And you just accept the fact that, yeah, you can't force your mind to stay on the meditation object. You don't have full control over your mind. Your mind does what it does, has habits, has momentum. And so all you can do is when you have that moment where you notice that your mind wandered, then you bring it back. And if you keep doing that over and over again, then the amount of time that you can keep your mind on the meditation object gets longer and longer. And the amount of time it takes you to realize that your mind has wandered gets shorter and shorter. And through doing that, you can have better control over your attention. So in a similar way, you have to stop analyzing and thinking, like when you're having your free flow time, right? And you said that you're doing 2 months of nothing but free flow immersion. I think that's a super good idea. I would highly recommend that. So for these 2 months, what you have to do is you'll find yourself analyzing the language naturally. That's a habit your brain has. So when you have that aha moment of like, oh, I'm analyzing the language, you have to just let that thought go, forget about it, and then pay attention to the story. And a couple minutes later, you might find yourself realizing that without even noticing, you again were analyzing the language. So again, then you just drop those analyzation thoughts and come back. And so you just have to do that over and over again. And so what you're aiming for is, imagine what it's like when you watch things in your native language, right? When you watch a movie in your native language, then you're just into the story. You're not really paying attention to the exact wording that all the characters are using, right? And what forms they're conjugating things into and how they're pronouncing things. You're just enjoying the story, and you're not really paying that much attention to the language. So that's what you want it to feel like, ideally, in your target language as well when you're doing free flow immersion. And so you already have a direct experiential reference point of what it should feel like, right? Just if you need to remember what it feels like, go watch a good movie in your native language, and then that's what it's supposed to feel like. So you don't really want to be thinking about the language. You just want to be thinking about the story, right? And so the best solution, right, is find content that's so interesting you get sucked in and you forget that it's even in a foreign language in the first place, right? You're just so like into the story. And so that's really what you want to do. But of course, if you have all these habits of analyzing the language, then it's going to take some time for those habits to unwind themselves. So just go through that kind of free flow immersion meditation process of letting go of the thoughts and just paying attention to the story. Pretend that you're a native speaker who's so fluent there's no even reason to think about the language in the first place. And then when you notice that you're thinking about the language again, then just again let go and come back. So yeah, and just accept that it's going to be a process, right? Accept that, yeah, you have habits. You're not going to be able to just suddenly drop all those habits. You have to let themselves kind of unwind themselves over time and work through that momentum. But you're going to be doing yourself a really big favor by actually doing that. So Remy asks, I learned French, and they said 2C, so I think they mean like Refold stage I learned French to the 2C, Refold stage 2C, and Spanish to Refold stage 2B in school, but didn't have much contact with either after graduation. Obviously, both languages have atrophied quite a lot over the years, and I've been working on getting them to a decent level over the past couple of months. However, the amount of time I'm able to dedicate to language learning is going to decrease in the near future, and I've been wondering how best to deal with this. I don't want either language to atrophy again, so I definitely plan on doing Anki and a bit of passive immersion in both. But how do you recommend I spend the remaining time? Would it be better to focus on one language intensively or divide time equally between the two? I mean, this is really a matter of what your personal goals and desires are, more than there being a right answer. If you want to actually improve at either of the two languages, then I would say that, yeah, you probably want to choose one of the two languages and just focus entirely on that. Because improving at a language is already difficult. If your time is very limited to spend on language learning, and you still are trying to improve at a language, then yeah, you want to be focusing on one language at a time. That I can definitely say. But if it's more like because your time is limited in the first place and improving in either one isn't really viable, and so then you're just fully on maintenance mode, right? You're just trying to avoid additional atrophy. Then I can say, yeah, you could split your time between the two, and that's probably optimal for maintaining what you have now without losing anything. So it depends on, do you want to optimize for maintenance or do you want to optimize for improvement? If you want to optimize for improvement, then you need to choose one language, put all your time into that. If you want to optimize for maintaining the exact language ability you have now, then you probably want to split your time between both languages pretty equally. That's what I'd say. So Anderson asks, is it harmful to see bilingual definitions when creating monolingual Anki cards? Because I use Yomi-chan and I have the JM dictionary installed, I often see the English translation of a word I'm creating a card for monolingually, and when I review the card later on in Anki, I always somehow remember and then associate the English definition I saw beforehand with the said word I'm trying to learn. I would install the JM dictionary, but I'm not super advanced in the language and still use bilingual definitions for some words. I would say that, yeah, I think it can be harmful because associations between your native language and target language, they can get created instantly, and once they get created, they can be very strong, right? And so I can actually remember there's certain words in Japanese that I learned like within my first 6 months to a year of learning Japanese, that I did learn them bilingually, and to this day I can still feel that association between the English word and the Japanese word are still there for some reason. And sometimes the English word and the Japanese word that I associated were like not even a good match, right? Because I additionally learned from textbooks. They weren't great textbooks. So I was told that, A in English equals B in Japanese. And that connection in my brain, later on I noticed, oh, well, actually A doesn't really equal B. And it's not even that this Japanese word can't be translated into English. It can be, and there's even a better word to translate it to, right? I was just taught a kind of crappy translation. But even to this day, if I ever have to explain what something in Japanese means in English, I'm more likely to use that English translation that I saw when I have that Japanese word in my head, right? Like A in English and B in Japanese are so tied that whenever I want to explain, I'm translating or I'm interpreting for somebody, I'm tempted to use that translation because that link got made in my brain when I first learned the word. And also, I think it can bias the way that you understand the word in your target language, right? I know for me, on the opposite end, right, most of the words I know in Japanese I learned monolingually, right? And so there's a lot of times when I would learn a word in Japanese. I could be reading a book in Japanese, I come across a word, I look it up, I read the monolingual definition, and I'm like, oh wow, it's such an interesting word. It's so interesting that Japanese has a word that means this particular thing. And I learned it that way, and I kind of thought oh yeah, why don't we have a word for this in English? That's such a cool word. And then randomly at some other points in time, I would be trying to translate something, and then I have an epiphany of oh, we do have that word in English. We use it all the time. Why did I not realize that it meant kind of something like that in English? And that was because I learned it monolingually, right? And so I didn't have that association. And I think it's really beneficial to not have that association, because then you kind of have a pure understanding in your target language, right? Because really, when you get strict, there are no one-to-one correlations between Japanese and English, right? You're talking about JMDic, so I know you're learning Japanese. And so basically any association that you have between a Japanese word and English word in a way is a false association, except in like very specific situations where it's like a scientific terminology that literally has a exact definition in both languages or something. Most words, they're slightly different. Even if you have two things that you could call close to meaning the same thing between Japanese and English, they aren't identical. There's some nuances that are different. And so when you're learning a Japanese word and you kind of input into your brain that, oh, this is the same as, XYZ in English, then your brain is going to kind of have this assumption that it really means the same thing. And so then when you're immersing in Japanese and things like that, then you kind of have this bias and you're going to kind of assume that there's nuances that the word has that it doesn't have. And you'll probably eventually be able to overcome this through lots of immersion, but it can also create blind spots, and maybe some of these things you won't notice, and it will lead to you having like slightly warped understandings of what certain words mean. I know that there was certain words where that happened to me for a long time, where it took me literally years to kind of like have the epiphany that my understanding of a word was slightly biased because I learned it through a bilingual definition. And so, yeah, I would definitely recommend, if once you're at the point where using the monolingual dictionary is viable, and it's not so difficult, like it sounds like you're making most of your cards monolingually, so that you are at this point, then I would say when you're making cards and look as much as you can in the wild, don't use the English dictionary, just use the Japanese dictionary, and that will do you a lot of favors. Now, you said sometimes you still need the English dictionary, because that will happen for a while. You have to get pretty advanced until you literally never have to rely on the bilingual dictionary. But it's good to make it a little bit more of a hassle, right? Like if you have Yomi-chan, which is super convenient, it's a pop-up dictionary, you can instantly look anything up. And so you can instantly get the monolingual definition, but to get the bilingual definition, you have to kind of copy the word, open up gshow.org in a separate tab, and then paste it in. That's a little bit extra work. So it makes it more likely that you'll just put in the extra effort that it takes to understand the monolingual definition instead of going and just looking at the English instead, right? Because you're kind of creating more friction when it comes to looking up a word in English. But when there is a word that is just way too hard or you can't understand the monolingual definition, well, then yeah, you can just open up another tab, paste it in, and then if you need to put it on a card, copy and paste the English definition onto your card. So if it's only a minority of words that you're actually using the bilingual dictionary for, then I would say, yeah, get rid of JMDict out of Yomi-chan and just go to gshow.org during those times that you need to use the bilingual dictionary. And then first of all, this will lead to you relying on the monolingual dictionary more, and it will help you grow your monolingual dictionary skills. But also it will help you avoid making unnecessary associations between English and Japanese, which will in turn help you have a more pure understanding of what the words mean in Japanese, and save yourself taking extra time to kind of overcome these biases that you carry over from English when you make associations between English words and Japanese words. So yeah, that was actually all the questions for this week on the Q&A. Answered every single one. So have no choice but to end early here. So thank you so much for watching. Thanks for everyone who asked their question, and best of luck with your language learning.